Howdy everyone. So, Monsters, Inc. It's a wonderful story that features many of the things that Pixar does best. And like many of the studio's other classics, one of the most special things about it is that it knows how to use their tried and true formula to help its predominantly young audience explore important, complex ideas about the world. A movie like Toy Story is ultimately about existentialism. The Incredibles is about self-actualization, Up is about grief, WALL-E's about the environment, and in the case of this film specifically, you could argue that it's about how a fear of the unknown can manipulate a society. So today, I'll be using a somewhat generous reading of Monsters, Inc. to explore the presence of fear in it, dissect some of the choices that may or may not provide commentary on said fear, and hopefully use all of that to provide some insights into how fear affects us and what we can do to prevent that. Here's a quick refresher on Monsters, Inc. for the heck of it. The film follows two best friends named Mike and Sully that work at a power plant named, you guessed it, Monsters, Inc., where they help power their city, Monstropolis' electrical grid. They do this not through the collection of coal or the use of windmills, but rather through the harvesting of screams. One night, while retrieving paperwork for Mike, Sully notices that there's an unattended door on the scaring floor. After investigating it, he comes face to face with a young human girl and is absolutely terrified by what he sees. You see, Sully and the other people in this world have long been taught that humans are dangerous, and that they're more or less babbling, somewhat sentient uranium rods that only want to see the world burn. Anyway, Sully books it the first second he can, and initially fails to realize that the supposedly radioactive Duracell battery he later names Boo followed him. All hell breaks loose in the city once she slips away from him again, and it's eventually up to him and Mike to return Boo to the human world before anyone can track her presence back to them. Oh, and along the way they discover that laughter makes the world go round or something, and Randy Newman goes ham over the credits. Perhaps more than any other Pixar film before or after it, Monsters, Inc. couldn't have connected with audiences any better or come out at a more relevant time in American culture. The movie went wide on November 2nd, 2001, a time that could best be described as being a somber and dark period in the country. The US was still under 2 months away from the September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center. Americans were scared of terrorist attacks happening in their backyards because of it, and the US-led invasion of Afghanistan was less than a month old. The minds behind this film obviously didn't know that any of this would happen or dominate the headlines by the time Monsters, Inc. hit theaters, but those anxieties still feel like they crop up within the movie itself. When the Monster Society discovers Boo, a mass panic ensues. Security gets ramped up at Monsters, Inc. in a way that evokes the imagery of increased terror vigilance from the time. Helicopters fly over the city and peek into windows in the hopes of finding her. Scared citizens get used for sound bites and share made-up, sensationalist tales of their run-in with a human. Sure, things aren't that intense and are mostly played for laughs since this is a kids' movie, but still, this is something that even the minds behind the film itself have acknowledged.
Even later with some of the scares about the anthrax.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so here, a fundamental element of the film are these big suited guys, walking around, and we're thinking, oh, this is actually...
We've been making this movie for years, and this thing just happened to happen right at the end of making the movie.
I think the sequence when Mike and Sully are running away from the sushi restaurant is the perfect example of what I'm talking about. An off-shared bit of trivia about this scene is that the decontamination field that gets fired in the background was originally supposed to be a straight-up explosion that obviously had to get swapped out after the Twin Towers fell.
Well, I don't think that thing could have gone any worse.
By the way, as this Reddit post points out, that's actually why Sully's bag has scorch marks on it when we see it again a bit later. It's because the thing originally got nuked. The point I'm trying to make is that Monsters, Inc. is 2001 in a nutshell, and that the film has long been looked at as a reflection of the fears and paranoia of that era. It's a film that came out during an exceedingly dark time in America, and is, at least on paper, about an exceedingly scary time in another society. Similar to how the so-called boring 90s, where things were relatively quiet from a Western perspective, came to an abrupt end on September 11th, the relatively optimistic city of Monstropolis was flipped upside down following a single event.
It is my professional opinion that now is the time to panic!
This naturally made Monsters, Inc. a great vehicle for many Americans to process the fear they experienced in the wake of those attacks, and because of what that year represents in the American psyche, also makes it a great vehicle for us to try and explore the nature and effects of fear in general. Because, and you might want to sit down for this on the off chance that I blow your mind in a sec, fear continues to influence and manipulate us to this day.
Thing that I remember most fondly about that time is that when the movie did finally come out, we had so many people come to us and say, thank you. Thank you for giving me something we could go out and do as a family, because people had, sheltered their kids from the news, and again, the mood was so dark in the world.
It was escapist, but it's also talking a lot about how to face fears, and I think, especially with kids, you hear a lot that Mike and Sully are a way that they learned how to not be afraid, and especially at that time.
Before we dive into things though, a quick plug. If you're enjoying this video and what I do here, I urge you to consider subscribing to this channel and enabling notifications. I don't exactly post regularly anymore, so making sure that you've done both of those things is the best way to ensure that you know whenever I have a new video out. You could also check me out on Patreon or become a channel member if you've got a few bucks to spare and want to show your support that way. And if not, no worries. You could still go the extra mile by answering the following question of the day in the comments. What's your favorite Pixar movie and why? Anyway, that's all for now. Thanks for sticking around, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this video. If I had to highlight one idea that the society in Monsters, Inc. lives and dies by, it's the bordering on cringe message that fear equals power. This isn't subtext. Fear, specifically the type experienced by human children, creates electricity. And as anyone that's seen Revenge of the Sith knows, electricity equals... Monstropolis runs on fear. Epinephrine and cortisol are basically what Dunkin' Donuts is to anyone over the age of 20. It's considered a respectable job to scare people, and the folks that do it are led to believe that they're doing important, patriotic work to which there's no alternative. Monsters, Inc. even runs commercials that play like corporate propaganda in order to reinforce this. However, this is totally false, as evidenced by the multiple times that Boo's laughter overloads the lights in whatever room she's in. The only problem is that nobody knows this.
What was that?
I have no idea. But it would be really great if it didn't do it again.
As far as society is concerned, the idea that nothing beats screams is common sense, and there's a widely accepted belief that goes along with this that humans are dangerous, which gets gently reinforced by that ad. It slipped into it in a few subtle ways, such as a title that appears when a kid is shown on screen that promises the viewers at home that he isn't real, as well as by a voiceover that states that while children are still innocent, they're becoming desensitized to becoming scared. These details imply danger. They're saying that children may not find monsters scary anymore, and that suggests both a loss of acquired power from them and a more metaphorical loss of power over them too.
Dear God, what have I done?
Oh, think again, Jimmy. You see, the firing pin in your gun was made of... Yep. Children!
Come back!
Children!
It may seem like a quick throwaway joke, but it's Monsters, Inc. manipulating the people that rely on them for power and technically fits the definition of fear-mongering. Which they do. I mean, like, that's literally their business. They monger fear. I don't even think it's that out of pocket to suspect that some of the people in Monstropolis know that children are nowhere near as dangerous as they're made out to be. For example, Mr. Waternoose and Randall don't seem to be concerned about touching Boo, and it may be because they know she's harmless. Sure, Waternoose does let out an exasperated gasp right before Mike tells him that Boo isn't toxic, but it's also entirely possible that this may have been his response to Mike and Sully figuring that out, as opposed to him being surprised by the revelation itself. If I'm being honest, he also seems more surprised that Boo is there specifically as opposed to any child in particular, as evidenced by the way that he refers to her as the child as opposed to a child when he sees her.
the child.
And I may be committing a false equivalence by saying this, but as a guy who's recently had to challenge life-threatening food allergies, I can almost guarantee you that someone that's been raised to believe that something can kill them in a single touch wouldn't grab it. Years of believing that would leave them more likely to react like everyone else does, regardless of if they consciously know better. That's just conditioning for you. At the very least, they'd interact with Boo while decked out in hazmat gear or oven mitts like Mike did.
Okay, it's all right. As long as it doesn't come near us, we're gonna be okay.
Additionally, we could question whether Waternoose and some of the higher-ups at Monsters, Inc. knew that laughs were more efficient than screams. This admittedly never comes up in the movie itself and does rely on some good old informed speculation to make sense, but does lead us down an interesting rabbit hole should we decide to consider it. If we take a step back and look at the situation in their world as a whole, it'd be preposterous if they didn't at least consider the possibility of there being a better option out there. Monstropolis is going through an energy crisis that's going to cause rolling blackouts, and the Monsters, Inc. ad informs us that kids aren't as scared of monsters as they used to be. Corporate may be using that as a means to sell the company to the public, but we can assume that there's at least some truth to that statement since the energy crisis is a real thing that they're trying to contend with. We know that MI has some sort of R&D department since they show it to us in the commercial, and because we see that they have a simulator set up in their plant. So it stands to reason that they've done some form of research into alternative energy, since we know that they've taken the time to study and research humans, energy, and how to extract that energy from humans. They'd be stupid if they didn't consider the idea that there's more than one way to get energy for their society.
We've tried nothing and we're all out of ideas.
Plus, the schmuck Mr. Waternoose says as much in the commercial.
And research into new energy techniques.
As for why they haven't turned their scare fair into a chuckle hut yet, well, there's a good chance that it's money. Look, it would probably cost an insane amount of money to retrain their staff and to mount a public awareness campaign to get people behind the idea. Plus, the guys over at the power company likely don't want to cut into their immediate profits with such a costly endeavor. After all, the first rule of capitalism is line must go up or else you're sleeping with the Nemos. Alternatively, it could be due to wanting to ensure a consistent demand for their product. I recognize how conspiratorial that sounds of me, but the idea of supply and demand is far from new, and artificial scarcity is also a thing. If you want to be especially nerdy about it, you could even look at something like the Phoebus cartel as an example of something similar happening in the real world. That was a real cartel that operated in the early 20th century that, and I'm not kidding when I say this, went out of their way to lower the life expectancy of incandescent light bulbs so that people would have to buy more of them. Sure, it's not the same thing as rejecting a better energy source, but it's in the same ballpark since it's a form of manipulating the demand for a product in the name of raising profits. Coincidentally, the cartel was active during the same era that had a direct influence on Waternoose's character design. More on that soon. None of those possibilities should come as a shock to anyone, since a huge portion of the film operates as a metaphor for our world's reliance on fossil fuels versus green energy, and because that's a major reason behind why our world hasn't made the switch to the degree that we probably should have either. To quote an era-adjacent Discover magazine article about oil and how we'll, quote, never run out of it, the cost of green technology remains prohibitive, and in a world swimming in oil, few companies and governments bother to spend big on alternative fuel technologies. Even if they did, the addiction to cheap oil would most likely persist. We could make the switch in fuels quite easily, but the switch in infrastructure would be far more difficult, says former Shell geologist John Edwards. The world is wired for oil. We've got hundreds of thousands of petrol stations around the world. The switch, when it comes, is going to be slow, and it's sure not going to be voluntary. That's likely what's going on in this movie too, right? The quote talks about the exact thing that Monsters, Inc. was partially inspired by, and offers a reasonable enough explanation for why the company hasn't backed away from their existing business model. To crib the title of a 2021 article on NASDAQ's website, a focus on profit is hindering progress, business, and the future. Profit and the continued success of his company is everything to Waternoose. He's an archetypical businessman in the vein of robber barons like J.D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan, down to the clothes he wears. And just like a robber baron from our world, Waternoose is a man of exorbitant wealth that makes and maintains that wealth through the exploitation of others. For Earth's barons, that meant workers that included child laborers, and for Monsters Inc., that means exploiting children as a form of labor. Remember, he's a guy that proudly declares that he'd kidnap 1,000 children and kill people for the sake of his company. Not for society or the people that work there, but for his company itself and his legacy.
Scaring isn't enough anymore. But kidnapping children? I'll kidnap 1,000 children before I let this company die, and I'll silence anyone who gets in my way!
And even if he didn't know that kids are harmless, he was willing to do all of that and potentially risk a child escaping and wreaking havoc on Monstropolis for those things. He may as well be the guy on that "we created a lot of value" comic. In the face of his own fear of losing the influence, i.e. power that his family name and legacy represents, he chooses to rely on violence and what is indisputably torture in order to reach his goals. He's an evil wolf of Wall Street in an early 20th century wool jacket. A spider-man that does whatever a baron can to prevent his worst nightmare of being, slightly less exorbitantly wealthy.
This company's been in my family for 3 generations. I would do anything to keep it from going under.
Though Waternoose can acknowledge that the times have changed and that scaring isn't the best way to get energy, he's so set in his ways that he can't do anything but double down on it. Because remember, fear is power as far as the world is concerned. And right now, all he wants is power. Which brings us back to Fear. You know, that sick game for the Xbox 360 and the subject of this graphic. Fear goes far beyond the walls of Monsters Inc. and the realm of electrical power. It's something that everyone in the movie experiences at some point, and it's something that, in its own way, allows for a different form of power to get harvested from the monsters on a societal level. In hindsight, you could flip a couple of the words around on that graphic and still have it make sense. I mean, think about it. If the monsters are all scared of humans, and there's reason to suspect that some people within the monster world, namely robber barons like Waternoose, but potentially some of the monsters in exile, know that this has no basis in reality, then why wouldn't this be common knowledge? And in the case of those monsters in exile, what are the chances that they were kicked out of their own world over knowing too much? That's one of the reasons why Mike and Sully were kicked out, so why not them too? What else could they have done to warrant banishment? To me, the answer is simple enough. It's because of the control it affords guys like Waternoose. Men like him get to control a narrative that the citizens of Monstropolis are in danger, and that experts, like the ones at his company, are trained, equipped, and eager to both protect them and enrich their lives. Fear isn't just the power he supplies the city, it's societal power in the form of influence. It's telling a group of people how to feel, scared, who to feel it toward, humans, and who to defer to, them, to make it go away.
Where am I? Monsters Incorporated. We scare because we care.
We can also look at the CDA, a government organization that exists to prevent and minimize human contamination. Though they're technically one of the good guys in that they're there to at least explicitly protect people, and since they ultimately reveal that they've been investigating Waternoose for a while now, they also represent both a creator of fear and a byproduct of it. The CDA are scary. They're a bunch of hazmat suit wearing monsters that SEAL Team 6 any building that has anything from the human world in it. They use excessive force to accomplish their goals and seemingly answer to no one. That's terrifying on paper, and the presence of the CDA in Monstropolis is enough to scare people since it implies that they're in imminent danger. It's like that one scene in Back to the Future when Marty tries to approach a passing car. All it takes is a peek at that yellow hazmat suit for people to crash out.
Listen, you gotta help me.
Stop, we'll be dead!
Yet there's more to them than that, since they're also a byproduct of their society's misplaced fear of humans. The organization's initials stand for Child Detection Agency, and their sole purpose is to protect people from children. Aside from being a pretty hilarious and great spin on the idea of people using fear-mongering to protect the children, this means that they have zero valid reason to exist. After all, if kids are harmless, then we don't need a specialized governmental group to constantly look for them, right? However, the fact that they do exist means that they're perpetuating the narrative that humans are dangerous. Whether it's intentional or not, they're feeding a circular argument, because if the CDA exists, then children are dangerous. And if everyone thinks that children are dangerous, then the CDA needs to exist. And to be clear, I don't necessarily think that this makes the CDA entirely good or evil. The end of the film shows that they aren't consciously a part of Waternoose's plans, and that they had likely fallen for some of the same fear-mongering that everyone else had. Regardless of whether or not Waternoose likes them and their interruptions in his plant, they're acting as useful idiots for a status quo that he stands to benefit from. Look, while I could keep digging at this movie to find ways that it explores fear, I think you get the point. Fear is everywhere in Monsters, Inc. It isn't just a product that's extracted from kids, it's a state that the inhabitants of Monstropolis live in, and it's something that influences their behavior. From the citizens that exaggerate the tale of their brush with a human to Waternoose, who may genuinely be a good guy that's been driven over the edge by the fear of losing his company, everything in the story revolves around that emotion. So because of that, I want to take some time to try and understand fear, what causes it, and what that feeling itself can cause within our bodies and society as a whole. Let's begin by defining fear to ensure that we're working from a similar understanding of it. A 2023 Simply Psychology article tells us that fear is a basic emotional response to a perceived threat or danger. It triggers the body's fight or flight response, leading to sociological changes like increased heart rate and adrenaline levels, and that it can also be attributed to feelings of stress and anxiety. It may also contribute to some feelings of disgust in those who experienced it, according to a 2020 study. We see each of these responses in Monsters, Inc. Most of Monstropolis reacts to Boo with either a fight response or a flight one. On the fight side of things, the CDA wants to rug splat the Rugrat, while everyone else's response encompasses flight. Even disgust kinda rears its head when we see the way that Mike handles Sully's eventual concern for her. He doesn't get why his best friend is willing to throw their lives away for her, and though it isn't textbook, oh my god, this is revolting disgust, it does come from that same emotional ballpark of disapproval and a lack of understanding or agreement.
We need to get to Boo.
Boo? What about us? Ever since that kid came in, you've ignored everything I've said, and now look where we are.
Anyway, in conjunction with fight or flight and those other emotions, fear can evoke a freeze or fawn response, forcing our bodies to a halt in the face of perceived or real danger, or to submit in the hope of survival. And once again, those responses are in the movie. Boo responds by freezing when she thinks that Randall is going to climb out of Sully's closet to scare her, and both Mike and Sully exhibit a fawn response when they try to appease Boo in order to make her stop crying. It doesn't work, but they do try it. So fear is a natural emotion that has a profound effect on our bodies, which leads me to the next point I want to make, that it's a very easy emotion to take advantage of since it's directly tied to our survival instincts. It's an emotion our species has had since we were cavemen, and a big enough dose of fear can still force our bodies to release adrenaline. Why? Because our bodies think we're about to die and wants us to either book it or bash whatever's got us scared to death's brains in. And even when we don't have an extreme or pronounced reaction to something, our body still experiences a few of the changes that thousands upon thousands of years of evolution have trained into it. Our blood pressure and heartbeat increases, our breathing can grow shallow, and we can develop a stomachache and get physically sick.
Oh, stomachache. Welcome back, old friend.
These effects are undeniable, and they're among the reasons that fear is even viewed as one of the primary causes of violence. The author of this Psychology Today article on the nature of violence suggests that anger, which is a natural motivator for hulking out, isn't a primary emotion, and that the feeling at the root of it is often fear. He says that fear that may stem from our upbringings has the ability to override our less evolved rational thinking skills, and that it can lead to some people committing violent crimes. Though I think the author doesn't do much to actually prove any of this in the way of referencing studies or providing more than anecdotal evidence for his theory, I do agree with him, and I was able to find some additional resources that back him up. Like this study from the peer-reviewed journal Neuroplasticity that's partially dedicated to discussing the way that fear promotes anger. I also found this article, that's admittedly by BetterHelp, that mentions a 1953 study about our sociological responses to both of these emotions. What this means is that all anyone really has to do to manipulate you is appeal to your ability to get scared. Yeah, I know, shocker, right? But it needs to be said because it's everywhere. For example, it's common knowledge that social media posts often have a negative slant to them, or that they're designed to incite fear and anger in us in order to stoke engagement. That's by design, and companies like Meta have known exactly what they're doing to us for years and simply don't care about how it's affecting our mental health. Here's the guys at More Perfect Union describing that exact thing in one of their videos from late September.
The term used inside the company was rage bait.
All that supercharged hate and misinformation helped incite violence abroad and at home. But when safety teams came up with proposals to reduce these issues, Zuckerberg and leadership shot them down. The reason? They were afraid it would hurt engagement, which is how Facebook sold ads.
Not to mention, fear is all over politics, especially these days, with candidates and representatives using it to incite action or get elected.
We have serious problems to solve, and we need serious people to solve them. And whatever your particular problem is, I promise you, Bob Rumson is not the least bit interested in solving it. He is interested in two things, and two things only: making you afraid of it and telling you who's to blame for it. That, ladies and gentlemen, is how you win elections.
It doesn't even matter if the things they're saying are rooted in reality at this point. It's become a bigger part of the game than it has for decades, and will likely only get worse for a while given how easy it is for misinformation to thrive online. It's such a common problem that Amnesty International felt the need to name an article about their 2017 State of World Human Rights report, Politics of Demonization, Breeding Division and Fear. Yeah, they just went and said the thing close to 10 years ago. In other words, and to go back to something I've said multiple times throughout this video, fear is power. It can stop us in our tracks, turn us into a bunch of bootlickers, or affect our ability to think clearly so well that we just sort of revert to being that ape with a bone in 2001. Look, it's like Yoda once said.
Fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering.
So what happens when an entire population gets convinced that something or someone is dangerous and out to get them? Well, they panic. Again, here comes Monsters, Inc. to show us this exact scenario. Scared citizens make up fantastic powers that the human tried to use to get them. The CDA nukes a sushi joint, and the CEO of PSE Scream or whatever uses it as justification to sign off on torturing kids. Like, no, really, that's exactly what that is. Bro graduated from a thinly veiled composite for child labor to horror boarding children. There's a desperation to everything that's going on in this film too. The energy crisis kind of reminded me of the one here in the US from the 70s due to how people were encouraged to conserve gas and power. The movie handles it with a glass half full mentality by having Sully point out how nice it would be for them to walk to work, yet the message is still there and it informs Waternoose's behavior. Likewise, there's no other way to read everyone's response to Boo being there other than to see it as a form of desperation. Everywhere Mike and Sully go in Monsters, Inc., people are afraid of what's happening or of being taken by the CDA.
23 no!
More than that, we see an element of fear-mongering that many of us will also find familiar. Straight-up dehumanization. There's the aforementioned news clip that I've shown a million times already, the way that Mike refers to Boo as an it, and the gamification of scaring children through a point system. In each of these cases, nobody acknowledges or ever seems to realize that they're talking about children that are barely cognizant and exhibit zero signs of having any ill will toward the monsters. Heck, Boo even gets along with some monster children when she wanders away from Mike and Sully. And why wouldn't she? Outside of looking different, she's exactly like them. There's also a great line from Fungus after Mike got captured by Randall.
I'm sorry, Wazowski, but Randall said I'm not allowed to fraternize with victims of his evil plot.
Though it doesn't directly apply to fear-mongering, it serves as an interesting snapshot of dehumanization at work. When you break it down, that joke explains the effect that his fear of humans has had on him. Fungus full stop says that what he's doing is evil. There's zero wiggle room there, and though he doesn't seem to connect the dots for himself, he also explains that he's not allowed to befriend or familiarize himself with someone that he calls a victim in the same sentence. Yes, he's talking about Mike, and Mike isn't a human, but let's not forget that Mike was only there by circumstance. Had Randall been paying closer attention back in Boo's room, it would have been her. And when they do finally get a hold of her, it is. That line says a lot about the nature of fear. It manipulates us into setting our critical thinking aside in the name of survival. However, because we just set our critical thinking skills aside, it also makes it harder to consider whether the danger being presented to us is real or imaginary. This encourages us to rely on tribalist thinking, choosing to draw a circle around and associate with a group that we know and think we understand in favor of protecting ourselves from a group that exists outside of that arbitrarily drawn circle. In the world of Monsters, Inc., this means that monsters good and humans bad. Worse, it runs the risk of implying that they probably don't even view humans as conscious, living, breathing, thinking beings, or don't care.
I am not an animal! I am a human being!
I don't care.
They fear something that they simultaneously, and sorry for using the word a lot, it's just that it really needs to be said this much, literally live to strike fear within. Fear may be power in their world, but that reality also invites the idea that the humans they're scared of have an untold amount of power over them, as we see when a toddler brings their society to its knees. And none of them realize this contradiction either, or fully process that the humans are likely to be just as scared of them as they are of them. Hell, that contradiction is repeatedly shown in the first act of the film. Scene 1. A monster uses a simulator to practice scaring a kid, screws up, and ends up being the one that got scared. A couple of scenes later, a monster exits a room visibly shaken after a kid didn't get scared of him. Then his assistant quickly destroys the door after deeming that it's done being of service to them. And a couple seconds after that, we see what happens when a frickin' sock gets stuck to somebody. The worst part of all of this is that in each of these cases, the monsters aren't just unaware that the number one rule of their society is paradoxical, they're actively feeding the paradox. The longer they go without realizing this, the more dire their world's energy situation will become. The more dire things get, the more desperate for power people get. And the more desperate people get for power, the more desperate and scared they'll get in general, which guys like Waternoose will then exploit in order to gain greater profits, power, or to protect the power and profits he already has. So now that we know the earth-shattering fact that fear is bad and that it has a pretty negative effect on us, you might be wondering what we can do about it, other than popping a Xanny and listening to Oingo Boingo's Nothing to Fear on repeat. Great song, by the way, you should totally listen to it later. After all, there's gotta be something that we can do to fight back against fear, right? Well, yeah, as a matter of fact, there's a lot that we could do, actually. When it comes to fear, there's no silver bullet solution to it. People get scared. That's just a fact of life, and we realistically don't want that to change. After all, fear exists for a reason. What can change, however, is how we handle that fear. Namely, whether we handle it constructively or destructively.
See, fear keeps you sharp, it keeps you awake, it makes you want to survive, you know what I mean? But the thing is, you gotta learn how to control it, all right? Because fear is like this fire, all right? And it's burning deep inside. Now, if you control it, Tommy, it's gonna make you hot. But you see, if this thing here, it controls you, it's gonna burn you and everything else around you up.
Constructively handling fear is when we make sure that our fears maintain a basis in reason and reality. It's something that we can do on an individual level, because people are individuals with free will and we can control our responses to stimuli in our lives. For someone with a fear of contracting an infectious disease, a constructive solution would be reading up on it and discussing it with your doctor so that you can take the necessary precautions to prevent getting sick, or learn if you're even susceptible to that illness. For a guy like me, who has severe food allergies, it's getting those allergies tested every few years to confirm whether I'm still allergic to them or not, then beginning exposure therapy to those foods if I test negative. And if you're Pajama Sam, it's going on a wacky adventure to find out that thunder and lightning aren't very frightening after all. And handling fear destructively is when we don't maintain a basis in reason or reality, or defer to another opinion without taking the time to question whether it's an informed one. An example of this is when we let ourselves go full caveman mode and let our fears dictate our actions instead of letting our actions dictate our fears. This is the purely instinctive type of fear that makes us think that everything is a saber-toothed tiger, and it can send us spiraling into tribalistic or us versus them thinking.
Kitty? You have beautiful eyes.
On a macro scale, destructive fear is what brought us such hits as the Salem witch trials, the Satanic Panic, or to share an example that's a wee bit more down to earth, Islamophobia following the 2001 attacks on the World Trade Center.
My wife goes down to Ground Zero for the next several days.
Wow.
And sets up the first triage centers and the first pharmacies. Somebody said to her, a fellow Arab said to her, "I'd cover my name if I was you."
At one point, a guidance counselor said to my face, we don't want your kind here. You have to leave. And I was there to ask whether I should be in AP chemistry.
In each of these cases, there was a massive communal panic over something that didn't quite add up when you stopped to think about it. The root of those fears made sense on some level, but the response didn't. No matter what every Stevie Nicks fan in the world will tell you, witches don't exist. Sorry, Practical Magic fans, but they don't. The witch trials were brought in part due to food shortages and economic downturn in Salem that were read through a Puritan worldview. Hanging suspected witches never solved anything. They were a convenient, though ineffective solution to a problem that people didn't understand.
That's right. I'm a witch. And I'm the one who withered your livestock, soured your sheep's milk, and made your shirts itchy.
Hey, you destroyed my turnip crop.
No, that was Gopher's.
As for the Satanic Panic, I don't know what to tell you guys. D&D didn't turn kids into violent criminals or make them want to end their lives. Nor were there satanic cults whose sole purpose was to sexually abuse children. In fact, there was even an empirical study done by the National Center on Child Abuse and Neglect that proved as much in 1994. The study found that not only was there no evidence of that being the case, the only instances where it seemed like that could have been a cause came from lone wolves or couples that used that logic in order to intimidate victims. The panic was a response to changing norms within pop culture and a broadening of moral anxiety thanks to shifting family dynamics that posed a seeming existential threat to the ways of yore. And in regard to the last example, look, I understand that the country was in a state of panic following that tragedy. I get it. I live in New Jersey, and I was 6 when it happened. Things were horrifying, and I remember being able to see the smoke from my hometown. But I also think it's worth remembering that people aren't the country that they're from, and that no one person represents an entire group.
You're being paranoid. Raheem is a really nice guy, and he's always helping. He rewired the toaster oven, and he showed me a back way to the airport.
Listen to yourself, Pete. I don't want to sound racist, but that Peter Pocket might be a terrorist. Does that sound racist?
Islamophobia in the early 21st century is a form of destructive fear because it didn't do enough to deal with things directly related to the tragedy and led to scapegoating normal, everyday people. It's also just a classic guilt by association fallacy. Person A committed an act of terrorism and is from a country in this region. Person B, who may have lived in the US for their entire life, has roots in that region. Therefore, Person B is also a terrorist. It doesn't really make sense when you try to do the math.
They see the way we look, they see the way we dress, and they often want an apology.
In each of these examples, there's a strong pattern of reactivity toward what scared us. Something unexpected shook a society to its core, and rather than observe what could have caused it so that they could address that specific thing, people jumped to something that felt like handling the problem, but didn't. In the case of Salem, this led to people dying that didn't need to die. With the Satanic Panic, it caused friction within families that took the bait and led to, as the name implies, panic. And with Islamophobia, it led to an entire region of people and the followers of the second biggest religion in the world being painted as violent and having to deal with profiling, disparagement, and racism for decades because of it.
We can win this war. Let's get rid of that dividend tax and get rid of Ahmed. USA!
I don't know.
Cut.
I'm sorry, guys. I consider myself a patriot, but I'm not comfortable doing this. I mean, it just seems really racist.
So, what should we do when something scares us? Well, we basically just need to try and remain constructive about how we deal with it. We should make an effort to keep our wits about us and to seriously consider the implications surrounding what we're afraid of. Because though we can't do this every single time something scares us and are still ultimately victims to instinct, we can hopefully learn how to at least gradually flatten that curve, so to speak. If we're scared of someone over something like their culture, or in the case of Monsters, Inc., because they're human, we can question why that scares us. And if the answer is tied to us simply not knowing much about that person or that culture, we can do the constructive thing of trying to learn about it. We don't have to agree with everything about it or like it, but the act of trying to look at things from a different perspective or learning a thing or two about it is a powerful opportunity for us to dispel a fear. One of the things I like to joke about with my friends is that I'm often trying to be more human. Whenever I say that, it's usually because I'm about to express an interest in thinking about something more critically, or from a place of empathy and curiosity. And I say that because those are things that our species can be exceptionally capable of doing. We used critical thinking to land on the moon. We have a complex means of communicating with each other, and the ability to consider what's being communicated with us in a way that's unique to our species. So when it comes to, for lack of a better term, beating fear, I think the answer lies in consciously tapping into the very thing that fear tends to overwrite, our critical thinking skills. When presented with information or a situation that gives us the spooks or overwhelms us, we need to do what we can to step back and think about what's happening, whether it's truly dangerous or not, and whether there's something we can do about it.
It's okay to lose to opponent, must not lose to fear!
Yo, I'm afraid! I'm afraid of him, alright?
Stay focused.
For some of life's common fears, we may find that there are simpler solutions than we initially thought there were. It may involve therapy or having to do some self-work, but those are a drop of water in the ocean in the grand scheme of things. More importantly, we may find that the thing we're scared of may not be scary at all, or that our fear is informed by misinformation or an agenda that was fed to us by a third party. From there, we could do some exposure therapy to see how there's nothing to be scared of after all, and to lay those fears to rest. The second point I listed is one that basically describes Monsters, Inc. Mike and Sully were scared of Boo because of what they had been told about humans, yet a single day with one was enough to make them realize that she isn't only harmless, but that they love her and that she's a victim of a nefarious plot. Because, yeah, she isn't a beast that can fly or use telekinetic powers on her prey. She's a toddler that's been painted out to be a nuke and Huggies, and all it took to dismiss that incorrect image of her was to hang out with her for a bit.
Boo! Oh, you're all right. I was so worried. Don't you ever run away from me again, young lady. Oh, but I'm so glad you're safe.
If we take the nature of Mike and Sully's fear of Boo and compare it to some of its real-world counterparts like xenophobia or just good old-fashioned racism, you'll see that that's the same thing that we can do for ourselves as individuals. If you're scared of a minority, I'm not joking when I say that working past that fear is as simple as meeting people within that minority and respectfully getting to know them. I get how patronizing and Sesame Street that sounds, but that's all it takes. This has a real basis in psychology and is known as the contact hypothesis. It was first proposed in 1954 by Gordon W. Allport and has been supported by multiple studies over the past 70 years. To quote its Simply Psychology page, it suggests that direct contact between members of different social and cultural groups can reduce prejudice, improve intergroup relations, and promote mutual understanding. Ultimately, I think a lot of that is what Monsters, Inc. builds to in regard to handling fear. Though the film doesn't allude to an explicit relationship between the two races, the switch to powering everything with laughs is mutually beneficial and comes from monsters developing a greater understanding of humans. Laughs are 10 times more powerful than screams were, so that solves the monster's energy crisis. On top of that, kids aren't getting traumatized like they used to be, which I'm told is a net positive. Rather than being afraid of each other, they've learned to coexist in a way that makes everyone happier. And, no pun intended, that's a powerful message. The film repeatedly asserts that fear is power, yet ends up developing that idea further by adding, but laughter and the things it represents, such as companionship, compassion, collaboration, and connection, is more powerful. It shows us that there are definitely things to fear, and that many of our fears could be valid, but that a little observation and consideration may help us focus on what's actually dangerous, say a person that knows how to exploit fear for material gain, as opposed to what only appears dangerous, like a toddler from a different world than us. Anyway, that brings us to the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and that if you did, you leave a like, subscribe, or answer the question of the day if you haven't already. Additionally, you're more than welcome to stalk me on Letterboxd or Blue Sky, or subscribe to my Patreon or become a channel member if you want to support the channel that way. So yeah, bye.